Disco Elysium, originally developed under the title No Truce with the Furies, is a role-playing game released in 2019 on PC and 2020 for most other platforms. Developed by the predominantly Estonian company ZAUM, it was a game rooted in failure, drinking and financial trouble. ZAUM was formed in 2016 by Robert Kurvitz and Kawa Kenda. The mythos of Disco Elysium originated in a steampunk concept from Kurvitz's own tabletop campaigns, from which he would draw many elements to begin writing a novel. During his time as an author, he met fellow novelist and advertising entrepreneur Kenda. Kenda partially funded and consulted on the book. The book, however, was a commercial failure and sent Kurvitz into a spiral of depression and substance abuse. Kurvitz eventually recovered and supported Kenda through his own period of alcoholism. Feeling once again invigorated and full of creativity, Kurvitz turned to Kenda and said, "We failed at so many things, let us also fail at making a video game." And so, development began. By early 2016 they were working out of an ex-gallery in Tallinn, Estonia. Much of the initial groundwork was self-funded by the staff and close family and friends. By late 2016 the studio had grown to 11 staff members working on the game full-time. They offset some of the costs by developing in Unity, but eventually had to secure a round of funding from venture capital. It was decided this money would be invested in hiring artists for the soundtrack. Kurvitz met with UK band British Sea Power in Birmingham, and with his trip came a fresh perspective, and so he also decided to move the core development team to the UK. Kenda would head up a London office while Kurvitz worked in Brighton. With the move to the UK came fresh talent, and by the end of development the game had 35 core developers, 20 contractors and 8 writers alongside Kurvitz working full time, from locations in China, Poland, Romania and the UK. It has an eclectic mix of Eastern European ideals and worldviews that bleed into the art and design of the game. Much like Pathologic, Stalker or Kingdom Come Deliverance, it throws out a lot of conventional Western and Japanese game design sensibilities in favour of building core mechanics that fit around its premise, without weighing down gameplay with excess features. The game has no unnecessary minigame for hacking or lockpicking, no forced genre melding. It even stripped out traditional combat in favour of a focused role-playing experience. As a result, Disco Elysium is a role-playing game in the most traditional sense. You are a member of the RCM, a pseudo-police force operating on the brink of collapse in a barely functioning society. The city and its people have been left impoverished and downtrodden by revolutions, drugs, greed and intolerance. The game has a laser focus on role-playing, to the point where every gameplay system has been built to revolve around and interact with the dialogue and skill check system. Combat, as mentioned, is non-existent. Inventory management is basic and doesn't involve slots or weight limits. ZAUM have taken a core mechanic, role-playing, and moulded a game around it, rather than take the shell of an existing RPG and window dress it with their own story. There are no conceits or last-minute systems here. Everything feels intricate, intermeshed, and designed from the ground up to facilitate your role-playing. In mechanical terms, the game operates purely through exploration and dialogue. You will be looking around the city of Revachol to uncover the culprit or culprits behind a murder. On top of this, your character has also become an extreme retrograde amnesiac, giving you the choice to reinvent yourself while also uncovering the past of the character, dubbed the Cop by the community. As you would expect, things quickly spiral out of control and you find yourself pitted between opposing forces in an ideological conflict that is soon coming to a head. The game world is a lavishly and highly packed map, not large in scale but large in detail. Everything is placed with some purpose, even if it's just to foster role-playing choices and used economically. You will never pick up a useless item, even if it just unlocks an extra bit of flavour dialogue from a character. Everything has a purpose. At points I did begin to feel I was revisiting areas a lot, but that was more so due to the fact that the game's quest system can be purposefully vague. There's no obvious objective markers, trackers or even indicators on the map. Issues do present themselves with this quest system in my opinion. Some events are explicitly time-based and the game notifies you of this, but others are gated behind progression through the game's day-night cycle, and this is not always clear. Some quests can also be somewhat vague in their structure or objective, and often you can receive dialogue that might indicate a new option has opened up in the world, but can often lead to nothing, though I would say this is a rare occurrence. I personally felt the game could have done a better job with the pacing of its side quests, as I reached a point during the mid-game where I had over 20 quests in my quest log, only to clear it down to about 8 by the next in-game day. It may have been more prudent to have gated more of these quests behind events and time, or to have gated the parts of the city where you pick up these quests. Otherwise, although many side quests and activities do feed into the main investigation, I think there could have been improvements made in terms of signposting what was core to the story, what quests ran adjacent or intersected the main story, and what was purely side story or character building. I do want to highlight that very few of the side quests feel like busy work. Even the very side stuff provides you with intriguing character building and world building. This game has no fetch quests, added simply for padding or XP. The quests all feel crafted and deliberate, and I cannot praise that enough in an RPG. As for how you go about building a character and role-playing, the game has two main systems: skills and their associated skill checks, and thoughts. The skills and checks work at a fundamental level similar to many other role-playing games. During character creation, you will either pick an archetype or manually assign points into 4 different branches of skills, each with 6 individual skills for a total of 24 skills. However, Disco Elysium does a good job of creating both unique and distinct skills. Unlike the more banal skills of Fallout with special or the generic pen and paper abilities, ZAUM have created quite flavourful skills which can often interact with characters and the game world in interesting and unexpected ways. A few examples would be skills like Inland Empire, Esprit de Corps, and Half-Light. Inland Empire represents an overactive imagination. It provides you with almost surreal interactions with the inanimate world. Esprit de Corps allows you to better gauge and rip off your buddy cop, and Half-Light represents alertness and instinctual response. Beyond this, the game works to subdivide certain more generic skill sets into more specific ones. The idea of speech or persuasion is broken down into many different aspects, as speech and dialogue is your main vehicle for agency in Disco Elysium. Once you have points in a skill, you can further increase the skill with level ups and bonuses gained from thoughts, a type of talent system, or from temporary bonuses by abusing substances and equipping clothing. Skill checks come in both active and passive forms. Passive checks occur during dialogue and provide you with analysis of a situation filtered through that particular skill's worldview. They are a sort of internal monologue for the character and can help direct the flow of your conversation in line with how you have built and perceive your character, or give you small pieces of useful information. Succeeding a passive check can also provide bonuses for the active checks. Active checks allow you to directly affect the world and can sometimes be failed with consequence. White checks can be retried anytime you gain a new point in that skill or via certain events. Red checks are one-time tries. Something I would have liked to have seen is more branching dialogue paths that resulted from failed checks. As it stands, you can just retry the vast majority of checks, and thus there's no interesting fail states for these skill checks. I think if they had provided intriguing or comedic fail states, you would also draw people away from save scumming their way through skill checks, and make failure its own interesting choice. The checks themselves have a difficulty ranging from trivial to impossible. To beat these checks you must get a higher or equal total. This total is calculated by adding your skills and any passive knowledge bonuses you have to the roll of a pair of d6. To simulate critical failures and critical successes, rolling double ones even if you outskill a check will always result in a fail, and double sixes even if you don't meet a check result in a success. The interesting thing about this system to me was the additive knowledge bonuses. It encourages you to talk and explore before making skill checks, and they can affect it both ways. Sometimes acting a certain way to a character or event can have negative modifiers on your skills checks, which is something I've rarely seen an RPG do and made me carefully think about dialogue options. The thoughts and associated thought cabinet act like talent points and a pseudo-talent tree, but they nearly always also have a drawback. They are predominantly focused around expressing your character's ideals and beliefs, and less so about wacky or zany effects like the perk system in Fallout. These thoughts are unlocked rather organically via dialogue and action. If you stumble across a piece of art in the world, and make several dialogue choices with artistic connotations, you can research a talent related to becoming an art cop. Keep talking about the plight of the worker, and you could become a communist cop. The system requires you to spend a skill point to unlock thoughts beyond the initial 3, eventually forcing you to choose between increasing an existing skill or expanding the thought cabinet. Once you have chosen to research one, it will unlock in a specific amount of time in line with the in-game clock. Some take an hour, others can take nearly a day. While researching thoughts, you will often receive temporary negatives to existing skills, and once unlocked you will receive bonuses and negatives to existing skills. Rarely you will get a unique thought that provides you with a benefit when you perform an action in line with that thought. Some of these sorts will even impose gameplay limitations upon you. I really liked how levelling up was handled in Disco Elysium. You will always need 100 XP to level up, and skill points are banked. You can earn 5 XP any time you discover something interesting through investigation, and if my experience with the game is correct, you are also rewarded 5 XP when you make deliberate choices to try and roleplay your character by choosing dialogue options or actions in line with one of your thoughts. You'll also receive 30 or 70 XP for completing quests, and what are known as secret tasks. These are essentially internal goals driven by the cop, rather than thrust on the player by NPCs or the world. Often these can be obtained through dialogue and completed by newly opened dialogue lines on other characters. It can create a reason to explore old areas just to see if anything's changed, without explicitly railroading the player into actions. The skills themselves are unfortunately quite poorly defined until you start implementing them in gameplay. The descriptions are vague and wordy, and it can be challenging to decipher what they initially do, though thankfully there isn't generally overlap in the thoughts. I put some of this down to lost in translation names. Inland Empire, as mentioned before, relates to an active imagination, so a more apt name might have been something akin to Palace of the Mind. I found some quests can be impossible to complete due to your choices, and it would be good if the game had a failure state to indicate this. At present, failed quests simply remain in your quest log. Related to that, you are also able to sell necessary side quest items to a vendor, but you have no option to buy them back. Thematically, the vendor is a pawn shop broker, so this choice to make it a one-way transaction is especially annoying. As seen in other games, the dialogue here greys out when you've already picked a choice, but as the dialogue branches, it would have been nice if the roots of each tree of dialogue remained lit up until all possible branches had been exhausted. The map system is also rather dreadful, and is tied more into aesthetic cohesiveness than legibility, and some of the skill checks it shows can be deactivated by performing other actions and checks, so it's either a bug or just again an odd design choice that those inaccessible checks aren't removed from your map. Although you can get through dialogue choices via different skill checks, I would have also liked this in alternate solutions to quests. Some quests do have alternate solutions in the sense that you can choose an ending, but I think providing some quests with more flexibility in how you achieve the goal would have been good. Although it isn't a major gripe, nor does it necessarily fit with the overall design goals of the game. For instance though, there is a quest where you can graffiti a wall, and you are seemingly presented a choice in what to use to graffiti the wall, but it's not really a choice, and you will always end up having to pick a predetermined option. As such, I would have liked to have seen more dynamic side quests at the very least. At the beginning of the game, you're given what you might deem a home base, where you should return each night to rest, and with this is a monetary cost to using the base. This forced me to play the opening hours in a specific way, hoarding money and acting in self-interest, which I wasn't a big fan of. I think signposting that the player can make other choices as to where they sleep at night, which have no monetary cost but provide other penalties, and isn't forced into the initial one, would have been a good decision by the developers. I also found virtually no reason not to metagame skill checks by equipping better armour and using a substance. As a result, the ability to switch during dialogue would have been a welcome addition. On top of this, although the inventory system is functional, it's not ergonomic, and a sort feature, auto-optimize, or filtering would have been very useful. I think ZAUM should have either made the clothing system more permanent in some sense, either making it that you could only store items at your home base and could only change in the evenings, and by extension making clothing more powerful to compensate for this, or they should have just made it easier to optimize clothes for your stats to pass skill checks. The visual style of this game is gorgeous. It feels like an isometric rendition of the impressionist and painterly style seen in Dishonored. It's extremely stylized without feeling cluttered, over-designed or clashing with the tone or theme of the game. In terms of technicals though, I did find the 3D character models to be a little too low poly for a 2019 release, and some of the backgrounds had weird resolution issues which made them much sharper and aliased than others. The grotesque gothic art of the character portrait, skills and the thought cabinet also felt a little jarring. Although very well done, I didn't find it to mesh with the rest of the style of the game. As for audio, the sound design and foley work in this game is fantastic. Soundscapes were extremely atmospheric, high fidelity and believable in terms of how layered and busy or quiet they were. The game does a good job of filling your ears with noise in the fishing village and creating the idea of a wild, thriving coastland. Or knowing when to throttle back and punctuate an empty building with creaks or gusts of wind. None of the sound effects seemed overly loud or quiet, and the mixing generally was imperceptible of issues. On the flip side, the soundtrack was more of a mixed bag for me. Although this is very subjective, I struggled to really pin down how the aesthetic of the music fit with the aesthetic of the locales. The theme for the hostel, for example, is extremely upbeat for what lies within and clashed for me. The main town theme gave me a very hard time in pinning down a cultural identity on Revachol. It felt more in tune with the emotions of the story than it did the location, and personally I didn't feel this worked. I also wasn't a big fan of how subdued and background the soundtrack to the game actually was. A lot of modern games and movies treat music like the foundation on which to build atmosphere and tension, but something that should be background in the grander scheme of things. I dislike this trend, and my go-to example is Wolfenstein: The New Order vs Doom 2016. Both are high-octane Bethesda published shooters, both predominantly composed by Mick Gordon, but they take radically different approaches to how their soundtrack is felt by the player. Wolfenstein's underscores events, Doom's highlights them, and for me Disco Elysium's soundtrack falls squarely in the former park. Everything is very placid, atmospheric and meandering. It's not bad by any means and certainly does help amplify the emotions of a scene, but never did it feel like a motif to an event or a significant part of the storytelling. Lastly, the voice acting for me was a really mixed bag too. If I had to compare it to anything, it would be Silent Hill 2. It's iconic and memorable, but in an odd way. The voices don't ever feel forced, they feel like real people saying real things. I understand most likely the voice acting was constrained by the budget of this game, but I think outside of your partner Kim and a child you meet named Kuno, none of the voices really stuck with me, but none of them really offended me either. I grew to appreciate them, but never did I really grow fond of them either. The script for this game for a 9-man team must have been a large undertaking, and it shows. If Ken Levine did a great job in Bioshock of portraying Randian objectivism and a deconstruction of extreme libertarianism, I think Kurvitz and his team really ran the gamut here and talked about socialism, democracy, fascism, syndicalism, self-determination and collectivism in intelligent and explorative ways. Although some of it can be surface level, none of it is amateurish or cloying. Oftentimes the writing can become a little bit too ambitious, but it's never bad. Somehow they've woven a tale full of sorrow, loss and darkness with stretches of comedy that had me laughing at my desk, acts of kindness that made me smile at how a character reacted, and clever twists and turns without ever really reaching a lull or dip in quality. It's impressive and some of the best writing I've seen in a game to date. My only gripe would be that the characters can sometimes become a bit too expository when trying to tell you about the world. They'll often talk about its various nations, organisations and people, and that sometimes phrases can be a little ostentatious in their prose, though I would like to give Kurvitz the benefit of the doubt here, since he's not writing in his native language, and that's always going to make translating your thoughts onto paper a little bit harder. From a technical point of view, I also think this game needed more time with Q&A and bug quashing. When I played it in early 2020, on any AMD driver, the game would crash without fail within an hour of gameplay, using the brilliant shader option. The game also doesn't scale particularly well at the low end. Running on a Ryzen 2000 laptop with Vega 3 graphics, the game was barely playable at 25 FPS on 720p on the lowest settings. Overall, the story itself is fantastic and the linchpin of the whole experience. Without a good story to rest on, the very gameplay of Disco Elysium would also fall apart. Thankfully, Kurvitz and his team of writers have managed to create an entire tabletop campaign world, pack it down into a 20-hour game, and not have the player feel burdened by knowledge. There is a lot of name dropping, and you never really build a clear picture of all the nations and ethnicities until you really pay attention, but it all worked as periphery world building and helped to endow some characters with a lot of unique aspects and interactions. The game also has somewhat of a nestled love story, but it was one that was very tastefully and cleverly done. Gaming is known for a lot of bad love stories, but the love story in Disco Elysium is both a mystery into itself and a joy to uncover. Talking about the story as a whole though, my main issue is with its structure. Due to both the nature of the day-night cycle and your freedom of gameplay, it seems the developers intended for a lot of optional choices and side quests to bulk out the main questline and give it more structure. However, if, like me, you do everything possible before going back to the main story, it can feel very disjointed. In something like Skyrim, this isn't necessarily a major issue, because it's a big world with a lot of multi-stage quest chains and you kind of hand wave the momentum of the story due to the scope. But Disco Elysium doesn't have that. It's small in scope and focused, so the ability to ignore the main quest for days at a time is often painful to the experience. I think they could have tied in the main quest events to the day-night cycle, forcing you to complete milestones before specific markers, but they would also need to be lenient with this system, so as not to leave players in a state where they cannot easily progress. As for the divergence of the story, I don't think they did a great job of allowing your actions to branch the narrative, especially during the ending. I would argue that during the game itself this lack of divergence works to ensure a strong, focused narrative without being diluted by multiple paths that are then contrived to converge. However, I think this caused massive problems for the ending, and unless they allow us to import our saves and decisions into a possible Disco Elysium 2, the ending is undoubtedly the weakest part of the game in my opinion. But before ending this review, I would like to briefly describe to you the ending of the game, as I saw a lot of outcry online regarding this and felt it was worth talking about in detail. Essentially, a climax occurs at what feels like the end of a potential Act 2 in a 3-act structure. Some big skill checks lead to big consequences, and the story time skips and reaches an end state where you unravel all the clues and the mystery is wrapped up. I didn't mind the killer reveal, and the other twist reveal at the end was rather interesting. But then, the game seems to continue to build. You have a very long stretch of dialogue with a group of characters, things seem to be about to crescendo to an epic epilogue, and then the game unceremoniously ends. There are no post-credit scenes, no where are they now or summary, it just kind of ends on a high note that never fully peaked. Many of the major threads of the story that ran parallel to the investigation felt unresolved, and although I've seen a lot of critique online attribute this to the enjoy the journey not the destination type of storytelling, I just didn't buy it. I have to say though, with all of this in mind, I would highly recommend Disco Elysium to any RPG fan, and would strongly recommend it to any fans of good storytelling.